another color, another coat of green. There's no reason why you have to do this all in one shot. I mean, I gave the sky in this particular area 2 layers. It still could use another 2 or 3 layers in order to create some variation. I want to get some green up in here. I also want to get a little more dark in this area, something more dramatic to add a sense of crispness. I also want to create a little more shape within those cloud areas or lighter areas of the sky. But you don't need to do it all in one shot. It's not going to take you 2 or 3 days, but at the same time, it's not something you're going to whip out in a half an hour or an hour. And I'm working on 2 things at one time. Now, if I was outside painting, this would probably be dry enough because of the heat, but it's taking a little longer. It's still shiny, and when you see the sheen on it, it's the moisture on the paper sitting on the surface that hasn't thoroughly soaked in yet. Okay, so it's going to take a little while for that to take place. Here I've got a pool right in there. If that bothers me, I can take a little sponge and soak up some of that extra water, you see. Or I could use a clean brush and just lay it there, and that extra moisture will soak up into the brush. You know, because right now if I tilt it, it's going to go outside that boundary, so I want to lay it flat. And that's why it's important you've got to have a good space you can use inside the house so that it won't get interrupted and your work session won't get interrupted, and you'll be able to leave your things out. So you can walk away right now for about half hour, come back, and this should be dry enough to be able to add some additional work. But you know, one thing to remember, first of all, there's nothing wrong with using a little pencil to begin your sketch, but you see how delicate that is, just enough to see your boundaries are. You know, I could have done that here. Instead I did it over with the bell pepper so that you have some sense of boundary, but you see how delicate it is, because you don't need anything that intense at all. Okay, that's not going to work to your advantage. But you know, showing these little pencil marks is not a problem, especially because I'm going to have additional color, a darker hue, a darker value of that green in order to create the ribs and the indented surfaces within that bell pepper. And so it's going to set up the location of that. So don't feel like you have to, you know, be on the trampoline without a net underneath, without a safety net. You can have a bit of a guide, but just don't turn it into a drawing. Okay. Now, those of you that are taking the section of the special topics in watercolor that's geared toward drawing, it's a different story. Okay. We're going to begin to talk a little about mixed media in your case, where maybe the use of watercolor is secondary to a drawing in which the majority of the surface is done perhaps with pencil or with ink. So we'll get to that later, but for the first, you know, experiment with how to apply, okay, and using, you know, your paper towel to, you see I've already set up some texture with that, or using the sponge. Another material that works or becomes an interesting tool is when I'm going to do another area here, experiment. Maybe this time I'll do an apple. Let me do a small apple here. See if I can get this to look a little more like an apple than I did in the first one. There's another clove, and of course here's your stem. Okay, so let's say in this example here, I'm going to go ahead and wet this. Let's see if this works. And I'm going to drop in a little red, even though I'd probably start with yellow, just so that I can have a little lighter red and use the yellow instead of using white. And drop a little red in there. Okay. And see how it wants to pool out into those areas. Now, there's a technique that, let's see if I can get it to work here. Of course, this could be total failure. You just drop a few little pellets, yeah, of salt. I don't know if you can see that, but it starts to create a speckled texture where the salt, once it dissolves, it begins to push the watercolor away a little bit, so it gives you this speckled, grainy effect. Reticulation is what it's called, and of course it gives you a little texture, so that could also be done here later on in the ground area to create some variation. You could even do it in the sky to simulate those, you know, little those clouds that sometimes, you know, fizzle out and get that real flimsy ending, and create that kind of surface by dropping salt into the area, and it gives you that particular type of quality. I also spoke about in your toolkit about having a just a stick. Okay, this is a stick that I just put a point on, and I'm going to take a little watercolor. I'm going to dip it in water. I'm going to pick a little of this blue here, and I'm going to put it on the tip. And then, you know, it can allow you to do a little line work. Let me choose something darker. Like I'm going to use a little of the black and mix it with a little of the green here, so I get something really fluid. So if you ever need to do something that's linear, it's a better tool to use than trying to do that with a fine brush, because a fine brush bends. And so once it bends, that means you're pressing harder. When you press harder, more ink or more watercolor drops out. And so if you want something that remains flimsy and thin, well, then you're better off using something like the stick in order to not spread over a broader area, to give you something that doesn't have a real fine, distinct edge to it. And of course, this costs you nothing. And again, just take a razor blade and put a little bit of a point on it. You can see that, and it'll give you that kind of effect there. Of course, this is going to be dry, because if I were to do this there, then that pencil, that line from the stick is going to bleed, and it's going to end up looking fuzzy and not have the crispness that you see in these examples here. It'll dissolve. Okay. Now, what about the salt? Well, once it dissolves, there may be some residue, but when the surface is dry, just flick it off with your hand so that there's any remnants of salt, it will dissipate. Okay. So let me do this again, just so that you can see it in a broader area. I'm just going to lay a little water here. Okay. And I'm going to drop some color in there. I think I'm going to drop some of this cheap blue here. Try to get rid of it, even though I like the color. So let me go ahead and spread this out so you can see it over a broader area. And once again, where's my salt? It's pushing, it's absorbing the color and then pushing it away, so you're getting these little white spots there. And once it's dry, you'll be able to flick the salt off, and then you're going to have the remaining white specks that it's left behind. So you can see that what's happening to it, giving you that textured effect there. Okay, so a little of what is possible. You know, don't try to do anything. You know, I turned this into a bit of a landscape, but just so that you can see what watercolor feels like, what it looks like. It's going to take some getting used to, because those of you that have painted in oil and acrylics are going to have a tough time getting used to nothing being on the paper or on the canvas. And where it's not canvas, that's another thing that might feel a little weird, is working on paper. Okay, so but get used to it, you know, feel what it's like, and then you know, gradually you'll feel a little bit more comfortable with it, You know, play around with putting water down and dropping color into it, keeping a shape with water, or, you know, covering the whole page or half a page with water and then dropping color into it or developing it. What happens when it starts to dry out a little? You can still get a blurred effect, but it's a little harder. You might have to scrub a little because the paper's drying out. The paper's buckling slightly, right? But that's why I'm keeping it taped down. Right? You want to keep pressing over because this will pull away, and you don't want to have a cockled watercolor drawing. But when I peel this off, and I'm not going to do it because it's still wet, you're going to get a nice clean border, which is another nice reason to use this and not just paint all the way to the edge. It gives you a nice clean border that sets off the color. Okay, so now in the next demonstration, I'm actually going to show you the still life object. All right, your first project. I'm going to send you those images, and I'm going to do a demonstration on developing it, and then it'll be in your hands. And again, we'll be working the same image. I'm going to give you a choice. I'm going to send you like 3 or 4 images for that first project, and you've got to do 2 of them. Okay, but remember, don't just do 2. You might need to do 4 or 5 of them and take the best 2 from there, because doing this and then jumping into that, you're still going to need a little time to feel comfortable with the medium. So, you know, get your feet wet gradually and you know, evaluate carefully over the ones you've done and make the selection on which 2 you're going to turn in on Thursday of the first week of July. Okay? All right.